This maid's belief in ghosts saved her life. This preacher confessed to murder and walked away. This escaped convict was a star witness in the greatest criminal trial in Alaskans history. And you are watching The Moonlit Ghost. Over 100 years ago, in March of 1922, a horrific scene was left at the Gruber family farm in Hinterkaifeck, Germany. Prior to this, the family maid had become increasingly disconcerted by strange things happening around the farmhouse. Strange sounds in the attic kept her up at night, and she concluded the house was haunted. One day after she had quit, Mr. Gruber found a newspaper. A publication 51 miles away in Munich on his property, which he hadn't subscribed to, but he shrugged it off thinking it was a mistake by the postman. However, after discussing this with his neighbors, he couldn't find anyone around who subscribed to it either. One cold night, Mr. Gruber walked around his house and discovered footsteps in the snow, approaching his house, coming from the Hexen Holes, or the Witch's Wood, the name of the forest across the field. Disconcertedly, there was no return footsteps, which implied whoever it was still on his property. Later that same night, footsteps were heard in the attic, and Mr. Gruber quickly investigated, already being on edge, but astonishingly, no one was there. The next day, he realized he had misplaced a key to his barn. He never found it. 7-year-old Kazia fell asleep at school one day shortly thereafter. When asked why, it was because she had been kept up all night. Her mother, 35-year-old Victoria, living on the Gruber family farm, had a fit of hysteria the night before and had run wildly into the Witch's Wood. Kazia followed her and found her crying in the woods alone, but didn't explain as to why. With the maid gone and Victoria regularly breaking down into fits of hysteria, chores were backing up. Mr. Gruber hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner. On March 31st, 1922, Maria showed up to the farm ready to work, and her first day on the job would be her last day alive. Most everyone knew everyone in the area, and when Mr. and Mrs. Gruber failed to show up to church, and when little Kazia missed 3 days of school without a word from her parents, neighbors got worried. No one had checked in on them earlier because smoke was still coming out of their chimney. But on the morning of April 1st, Hans and Eduardo Skierowski showed up to the Gruber farm selling coffee. They noticed that no one was around, but their animals appeared to be taken care of, so they figured the Grubers were just out for the day. Then, 4 days after that, Albert Hoffner showed up to fix the family's food chopper. Again, noticing no one around, he found the chopper in the shed and spent 4 hours fixing it alone, hearing the animals in the barn and thinking nothing of it. Then finally, neighbor Lawrence Schlittenbauer came to investigate where the Grubers were. This is when he entered the barn, which had previously been locked, but somehow he had a key. That is where he found Mr. and Mrs. Gruber, along with their granddaughter Kazia and her mother Victoria, all dead, piled in a stack of hay in the corner of the barn, all with gruesome head injuries. And little Kazia appeared to have survived a while after she had been struck. She had a tuft of her own hair gripped in her hand. She had torn it out. Victoria had a 2-year-old baby boy, Josef. He, along with Maria Baumgartner, were both found dead in the house with the same injuries. There was little sign of struggle, and Munich police concluded that the murderer had lured each family member one by one into the barn before surprising each one and killing them, then entering the house and killing Maria first, and then the helpless 2-year-old Joseph last in his crib. Inside the house were found recent meals, which meant the killer had made himself at home for 4 days before the bodies were discovered. Now, everyone in the area knew that the previous maid believed that the house was haunted, and since the Grubers didn't have any known enemies, gossip spread that the killings were of a supernatural nature. However, during the criminal trial and investigation, it came to light that their neighbor, the one who found them, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, was in a relationship with Victoria. In fact, he was being forced to pay child support for Joseph. But Joseph wasn't his child. It was Mr. Gruber's child. Mr. Gruber and his daughter Victoria had an incestuous relationship. And it was argued that when Lawrence found this out, it was too much and he killed them all in a fit of rage. He even made a chilling comment about how when the family was killed, the ground was frozen and it stopped the killer from burying the bodies, so he buried them in the hay instead. Lawrence was the primary suspect for the rest of his life, but he was never found guilty. The farm was demolished 1 year after the killings, and it was only then that the murder weapon was found in the attic. It was a mattock the killer had used to murder 6 people, including 1 infant child. In 1912, Josiah and Sarah Moore and their 4 children, Herman 11, Mary 10, Arthur 7, and Paul 5, lived in Villisca, Iowa. They were a well-off family and well-liked in the community. In fact, on the evening of June 9th, 1912, Sarah had organized a Children's Day program at their local Presbyterian church, which went off without a hitch. And after the program, Sarah's daughter Mary invited Ina and Lena Stillinger, 2 of her friends, over to the house to spend the night, a decision that forever haunts the Stillinger family. The Moore family, along with the 2 Stillinger girls, walked to their house from the church, arriving home around 9:45 p.m. The night went, and the morning came, and around 7 a.m., Mary Peckham, the Moores' neighbor, was out in her front yard doing her morning chores and noticed the Moores were nowhere to be seen. Normally, they were out at this time attending to their chores. She knocked on their door, and when no one answered, she tried to let herself in, but the front door was still locked. She went over and let the Moores' chickens out of their coop. Then she sent for Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. He showed up, and still no one came to the door, even after he shouted their names, Josiah, Sarah. And still, it was just unsettlingly quiet from inside the house. He had a key to the house, and so he let himself in. Carefully, he opened the door to the guest bedroom, where he saw the gruesome sight of Ina and Lena Stillinger, the 2 neighbor girls. They were both lying on the bed, with their heads smashed in. They were dead. Ross immediately sent for Hank, the peace officer, and he searched the house, where he discovered the additional bodies of Josiah, Sarah, and their 4 children. Each one had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, the murder weapon, one of Josiah's axes. It was found in the guest room with the 2 Stillinger girls. It seems they were last, and perhaps an unfortunate happenstance that they were there at all. Investigators discovered 2 spent cigarettes in the attic of the Moores' home, implying that the murderer had access to their house and had patiently waited for them to come home from the children's program and for the entire family to go to sleep. Then the killer quietly descended from the attic, carefully covered up all of the windows with towels and clothing. Then he or she targeted Josiah first, using the bladed edge of the axe on only him while using the blunt end on the rest. Josiah also had 2 more blows to the head than every other victim. There was even a gouge mark in the ceiling where the killer's swing hit it. It's clear he wanted Josiah out of the way before continuing on with the rest of the family. And horribly, it appeared that at least one of the 2 Stillinger girls, Lena, at only 12 years old, had woken up during the murders, as her body was twisted over the bed and had defensive injuries on her arms. The killer then carefully placed the axe on the ground in the guest's bedroom, next to the girls, and perplexingly, whoever it was then took a 4-pound slab of bacon out of the icebox and placed it next to the axe, something to this day that no one understands why. There were several suspects, but one stood out. It was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling minister who had attended the Children's Day service the day before the murders and had left Villisca just hours before the bodies were discovered. During his trial, shockingly, he actually confessed to the murders. However, the jury didn't believe him. Kelly was prone to mental breakdowns and regarded by many as a little off, but not a mass murderer. He would go on to fixate on the case, writing letter after letter to the police and to the surviving family members, details about the case, since he later claimed to have been in the vicinity as the murders were taking place. Authorities, though, questioned if he actually knew details of the case because he had done it or because he was imagining it. A few years later, he was arrested on unrelated charges of a sexual nature and sent to Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. And finally, in 1917, police obtained yet another confession from him, where he admitted once again to the Moore family murders. However, he later recanted his confession, and after 2 long trials, once again, he was acquitted. Multiple others have been suggested as the murderer, including a cocaine-addicted serial killer implicated in other killings. But as of today, the case remains unsolved. Craig, Alaska, would largely stay out of the public's eye until one fateful day in September of 1982. Craig is home to the largest mass murder and most drawn-out and expensive criminal trial in the state's history. If you're unfamiliar with its resolution, the outcome might surprise you. Mark Colthurst sailed his state-of-the-art fishing boat, the Investor, which he'd recently purchased for a cool $750,000, into port. On board the Investor at this time was himself and his wife Irene, both 28 years old, she being 3 months pregnant, along with their 5-year-old daughter Kimberly and their son John, who had just turned 4. 4 others were on board who were deckhands that Mark had chosen because he knew each one well, and each had a solid work ethic and he trusted them around his family. These were 17-year-old Chris Heyman, 19-year-old Dean Moon, 19-year-old Jerem Cohn, and Michael Stewart, Mark's 19-year-old cousin. Being Mark's 28th birthday, he and his family went out to celebrate at Ruth Ann's restaurant in Craig, where Mark ran into John Peel, a former member of his crew who had recently started his own family. They briefly talked, and around 9:30 p.m., the Colthurst family left Ruth's and went back to the Investor for the night. Most of the crews docked in Craig that night were also celebrating the end of the salmon season. Many stayed up all night partying and drinking, and many would be up until the early morning hours of Monday, September 6th. It was around this time that an ominous fog rolled in over Craig. At 6:30 a.m., a crewman of a nearby ship noticed that the Investor was slowly drifting away from port, and someone was steering it away silently into the fog. And later, Jim Robinson saw a man riding the Investor's skiff toward Craig. He also saw the man purchase gasoline, get back on the skiff, and disappear into the fog. Later that evening, the Investor, now docked a mile away near Fish Egg Island, went up in flames. The blaze had done significant damage before the Coast Guard showed up, and it's then that they discovered the charred remains of 4 individuals on board. A forensic examination clearly showed that 2 of the remains were of Mark and Irene Colthurst. What's more, both of them were shot in the back of the head. Ultimately, the remains of 5 of the 8 on board Mark's ship were identified, with 2 others' remains being unable to be determined, and 1 completely missing. Chris Heyman and Dean Moon were the ones assumed to be unidentified, and John, Mark's 4-year-old son, with no remains whatsoever, was assumed to be completely cremated in the fire. In the ensuing months, authorities would interview everyone they could, and a sketch of the person on the skiff was issued. However, something Lee Axemaker, the mayor of Craig, said would set the stage for the most drawn-out, complex, and expensive trial in Alaska's history. He said, "There were probably 500 guys in town at that time that looked just like him. It could have been nearly anyone, and captains of every ship docked that day became paranoid that the murderer was one of their crew. And just like a classic whodunit, everyone was now a suspect." An astonishing 2 years went by, and it would seem the culprit had gotten away. But this was something Lieutenant Robert Gent couldn't abide, and by the summer of 1984, officials had received 2 separate anonymous tips about a certain individual. With an overabundance of circumstantial evidence, Lieutenant Gent, head of the Alaska State Troopers Investigation Bureau, honed in on one man, John Peel, ultimately charging him with all 8 counts of murder, and a trial to convict was underway. John Peel had had an on-again, off-again relationship with Mark's sister for a number of years leading up to the murders. He fit the description of eyewitnesses. He knew Mark was in Craig as he had seen him at Ruth's, and it was reported that he had sold members of Mark's crew weed the night before the murders, a point which would become more significant as more information was uncovered. The prosecutors accused Peel of harboring resentment for Mark, since Mark had fired Peel as a member of his crew a few years earlier for drug use. But there was more. A damning testimony came from Jim Robinson, who testified under oath that it was Peel riding the investor's skiff and later purchasing gasoline, which was presumed to have been used to start the fire. All of that said, the prosecutor's case was far from airtight, and his defense exploited their lack of evidence, including the fact that there was no murder weapon. Also, Peel had absolutely no record and no prior indicators that he could engage in such a violent crime. For all intents and purposes, Peel was a rather average individual who had gotten married and had his first son just a year prior to the murders. Even some of Mark's own family came to Peel's defense, and Brett Rendemel testified, "He didn't even have the nerve to punch anyone. I'd believe the investor killer was my mother before I'd believe it was him." And although there were several independent eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen Peel purchase the gasoline and take it back to the skiff, a major blow to the prosecutor's case came from a forensic investigation of the investor. It turned out the accelerant used to burn the investor was kerosene, not gasoline. The defense also boldly accused the state of Alaska for destroying evidence, because unbelievably, as state authorities were towing the remains of the investor, they let it sink. The defense said, "We are now tasked with scouring the bottom of the ocean for evidence." But then another damning story came in. Captain Larry Demmert Jr. of the Libby 8 and the ship Peel was working on at the time of the murders said under oath, "I think I heard a woman scream. Immediately after that, I heard popping sounds like a generator backfiring. I wasn't sure. I was real scared. I had never been that scared in my life. It was like there was danger in the air, evil in the air. It was real thick. I saw John Peel standing on the dock. It looked like he might have had a rifle in his hand." Things were looking bad for Peel. However, his defense quickly pointed out that Demmert was only testifying to avoid separate drug charges he was facing. He was then subsequently grilled about his addiction to Valium and how that could have easily impaired his recollection of the night of the murders. The trial would last nearly 2 years, and every tactic was resorted to convict Peel, and his defense retaliated with every round of accusations. They claimed witnesses were coerced into testifying, that evidence was falsified and destroyed. Peel even wore an elaborate mask to court in order to stop the jury from imagining Peel as the killer. They tried to get the case dismissed a dozen times on grounds of prejudice, but to no avail. Finally, Peel's fate was in the hands of the jury, who scrutinized over 800 pieces of evidence, listened to contradictory and confusing eyewitness testimony of over 150 people, most of which had been flown back and forth from Washington to Ketchikan, Alaska, resulting in a criminal trial that cost, in today's money, about $5.5 million. After weeks of deliberation, the jury couldn't come to a consensus. It was a hung jury, 7-5, leaning in Peel's favor. After the trial, a shocking testimony came forth from brothers Walter and Charlize Samuelson, who both claimed that Peel had confided in them that he had killed those aboard the Investor. Walter said, "John looked at me and said, 'I did it. I killed them.' He kind of had a weird smile." This was enough for prosecutors to bring another case against Peel. A second trial ensued. The trial resulted in similar themes, and tensions were at an all-time high. The judge had to regularly threaten both sides of the courtroom for emotional outbursts, people yelling and screaming, hitting their desks and tables in court. The prosecution presented new witnesses, and astonishingly, Peel's attorney, in a strategic play, called no witnesses of his own, a gambit that paid off. He said, "From the moment it was issued, I have always said the indictment was not worth the paper it was written on. I didn't put a case on because there was no need to dignify this case by putting on witnesses." The prosecutors put an innocent man and his family through this ordeal for years. At the end of the second trial, the judge instructed the jury to make a unified final decision, so Peel couldn't be tried again. They were to find him guilty or acquit him. There would be no hung jury this time. The jury found Peel not guilty. Peel was 22 at the time of the murders. By the time both trials were over, he was nearly 30 and financially destitute. He would sue the state of Alaska and ultimately won $900,000 in restitution. After it was all over, he said, "Somebody out there knows what happened, but I'm not going to waste any more of my life on it." But Mary Ann Henry, the prosecutor, had a different outlook. She said, "Our system is built on the theory that it's better to let 9 guilty persons go free than to convict one innocent man. In this case, John Peel is going free for 9 crimes. I can say that it's the state's view that we know who the killer is. It's just apparent that the state was not able to convince the jury that there was sufficient evidence of that." John Peel is still alive today, and for decades, the living family of Mark and Irene have believed that he was the killer. But in recent years, John agreed to meet with Lori Hart, Mark's sister, to answer questions in a private setting over dinner. And Lori, astonishingly, actually had a change of heart. She said, "I don't know if Peel is the one who pulled the trigger, but I think he knows more than he's saying. If he, Peel, really is innocent, that means law enforcement missed the mark entirely and spent millions pursuing the wrong person, allowing the real killer to get off scot-free. In fact, you remember Jim Robinson, the man who originally identified Peel as the man on the skiff and the one buying gasoline? His testimony was one of the most crucial in the entire investigation. He would go on to charter ships to clean up Exxon's disastrous oil spill in 1989. Unfortunately, 2 of his own crew at that time were presumed killed during an accident, and they were never seen again. And it was only when this story broke that it was discovered that Jim Robinson was actually Kenneth Robertson, a convicted arsonist with a history of violent crime who was wanted in the state of Arizona since June of 1981. Kenneth was incarcerated for burning a building, threatening to kill his wife and her entire family with his sawed-off shotgun, and engulfing her car in flames in an attempt on her life. He escaped incarceration with 4 years left on his sentence and made his way to Craig, Alaska, where he then served as the star witness in the largest criminal trial in the state's history. However, to this day, no one has been found guilty of the investor murders. These stories go to show that sometimes, unfortunately, the criminal gets away, but I think one day we will all stand accountable for the things that we have done, whether in this life or the next. Stay safe out there, ghosts, and remember, stay paranormal. And like and subscribe right now, or I will haunt you in your sleep tonight.